It was supposed to be a routine talk show appearance for Dean Martin, but feminist activist Dr. Patricia Morris had other plans. She spent 10 minutes on live TV systematically destroying his reputation and his character. Then the cameras caught what happened backstage, and everything changed. It was March 15, 1972, and Dean Martin was appearing on the Dick Cavett Show to promote his upcoming Vegas run. At 54, Dean was still at the peak of his career. His television variety show was a ratings giant, his records were selling millions, and his Vegas shows were packed every night. But the America Dean had helped entertain for decades was changing rapidly around him. The women's liberation movement was gaining momentum, traditional gender roles were being questioned, and male entertainers who had once been seen as charming were now being viewed by some as symbols of an outdated sexist culture. Dr. Patricia Morris was one of the leading voices of this cultural revolution. A professor of women's studies at Columbia University and author of the best-selling book Breaking the Glass Ceiling, she had made a career out of challenging what she saw as the patriarchal power structures that dominated American society. Patricia was brilliant, articulate, and absolutely fearless when it came to confronting powerful men who she believed represented everything wrong with traditional masculinity. She had already taken on politicians, business leaders, and other entertainers on national television, and her appearances always make headlines. When Dick Cavett's producers told her that Dean Martin would be the other guest on that night's show, Patricia saw an opportunity she couldn't pass up. Dean Martin, in her mind, was the perfect symbol of everything she was fighting against. A man who had built his career on playing drunk, treating women as decorative objects, and promoting an image of masculinity that she believed was harmful to society. She came to the studio that night prepared for war. The show started normally enough. Dick Cavett introduced Dean Martin to thunderous applause from the studio audience. Dean was his usual charming self, relaxed, funny, self-deprecating about his drinking persona, and completely at ease in front of the cameras. "Dean, you've been entertaining America for more than 25 years now," Cavett said. "What's the secret to your longevity?" Dean smiled that famous smile and drawled, "Well, Dick, I just try to give people what they want. A few laughs, a few songs, and maybe help them forget their troubles for a while." It was a perfectly innocent answer, but Patricia Morris was already preparing to pounce. When Cavett introduced her, Patricia came out swinging immediately. "Mr. Martin," she began, her voice crisp and professional, "don't you think that attitude is exactly what's wrong with entertainment today? This idea that we should just help people forget their troubles instead of encouraging them to confront the real problems in society." Dean looked slightly surprised, but maintained his composure. "Well, Dr. Morris, I'm not sure entertainment has to solve all the world's problems. Sometimes people just want to relax and have a good time." "But that's exactly the point," fired back Patricia. "Your entire career has been built on promoting an image of masculinity that treats women as objects, glorifies drinking and irresponsibility, and tells men that it's acceptable to be emotionally detached and uncommitted." The studio audience fell silent. This wasn't the light-hearted celebrity interview they were expecting. Dean shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I think you might be reading a little too much into a few songs and some comedy routines." But Patricia was just getting started. She had clearly come prepared with specific examples, and she began systematically dismantling Dean's public image piece by piece. "Let's talk about your movies with Jerry Lewis. In film after film, you played the handsome playboy who seduced women and then abandoned them without consequence. You literally made a career out of modeling irresponsible male behavior."
"Those were comedies," Dean protested weakly. "They were meant to be funny, not instructional." "And what about your famous drinking persona? You've spent decades making alcoholism seem glamorous and harmless. Do you have any idea how many young men have tried to emulate your behavior, thinking that constant drinking was the key to being cool and attractive?" Dean tried to explain that his drinking was mostly an act, that the drinks on stage were usually apple juice, but Patricia wasn't interested in his explanations. Even if it was an act, what does it say about our society that we find a man pretending to be drunk more entertaining than a man being authentic and emotionally available? For 10 excruciating minutes, Patricia Morris systematically destroyed Dean Martin's public image on national television. She criticized his treatment of women, his promotion of harmful stereotypes, his contribution to what she called toxic masculinity, and his general irrelevance to a changing America. Dean barely fought back. He made a few weak attempts to defend himself, but he seemed genuinely shocked by the ferocity of her attack. The man who could handle mafia bosses and hostile crowds was completely unprepared for a feminist intellectual who had done her homework. "Mr. Martin," Patricia concluded, "you represent everything that the women's liberation movement is fighting against. You're a relic of an era when men could coast on charm and good looks while contributing nothing meaningful to society. The fact that you're still popular shows how much work we still have to do." The audience didn't know how to react. Some applauded Patricia's boldness, while others seemed uncomfortable with the personal nature of her attacks. Dean just sat there, looking like he'd been hit by a truck. Dick Cavett, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interview had taken, tried to lighten the mood. "Well, this has certainly been educational. We'll be right back after these messages." As soon as the cameras stopped rolling and they went to commercial break, Patricia expected to feel triumphant. She had just taken down one of America's most beloved entertainers on national television, exposing him as the outdated relic she believed him to be. But what happened next completely changed her understanding of who Dean Martin really was. As the studio crew reset for the next segment, Dean's assistant approached him with an urgent whisper. Dean's face immediately changed from embarrassed confusion to serious concern. Patricia, who was checking her notes and preparing for the rest of the interview, couldn't help but overhear what was being said. "Mr. Martin, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's about Tommy. His condition has gotten worse, and the doctors say tonight might be, well, they think you should come if you can." Dean immediately stood up and started removing his microphone. "Tell them I'm on my way. Get the car ready." "But Mr. Martin, you're in the middle of a television taping." "The show doesn't matter," Dean said, quietly but firmly. "Tommy matters." Patricia watched in confusion as Dean started to leave the set. Dick Cavett, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interview had taken, approached him concerned. "Dean, what's happening? We still have 2 more segments." Dean paused and spoke in a voice that was completely different from his usual casual drawl. It was the voice of a man who had his priorities straight. "Dick, there's a little boy who's been fighting cancer for 8 months. I've been visiting him every week when I'm in town. His name is Tommy Rodriguez. He's 7 years old, and he's dying. The doctors say tonight might be his last night, and I promised him I'd be there." Cavett was stunned. "Dean, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Dean replied. "It's not something I talk about. Tommy doesn't need publicity. He just needs someone to hold his hand." Patricia Morris felt her entire worldview shifting as she listened to this conversation. "I've been visiting kids in hospitals for 15 years, Dean continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "Not for cameras, not for publicity, not to make myself look good, because when you're 7 years old and you're dying, you shouldn't have to die alone." Dean's assistant had his coat ready. As Dean put it on, he turned back to Cavett. "Dick, I'm sorry about the show. I know this creates problems for you, but I made a promise to a little boy, and that promise is more important than anything else I could do tonight." Then Dean Martin walked off the set, leaving behind a national television appearance to go sit by the bedside of a dying child that nobody knew he'd been visiting. Patricia Morris stood in the middle of the television studio, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. For 10 minutes, she had systematically attacked a man she thought she understood, calling him shallow, selfish, and irrelevant. Now she was discovering that the same man had been secretly visiting dying children for over a decade.
Dick Cavett approached her, clearly shaken by what had just happened. "Patricia, I think we need to talk about how to handle the rest of the show." But Patricia was barely listening. Her mind was racing as she tried to reconcile what she had just witnessed with everything she thought she knew about Dean Martin. "Dick," she said slowly, "how many people know about this, about Dean visiting sick children?" Cavett shrugged. "Hardly anyone. Dean never talks about it publicly. We only know because one of our producers has a friend who works at the children's hospital. Apparently, Dean has been doing this for years, but he insists that no one ever mention it to the press." Patricia felt a wave of nausea as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had just spent 10 minutes on national television attacking a man's character without knowing the first thing about who he really was.
"He never uses it for publicity?" she asked. "Never," Cavett confirmed. "In fact, he specifically asks that his visits be kept secret. He doesn't want the families to feel like they're being used for some kind of public relations campaign." When the show resumed after the commercial break, Dick Cavett explained to the audience that Dean Martin had been called away on an urgent family matter and would not be returning. He didn't mention Tommy Rodriguez or the hospital visits. Patricia finished the interview, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. All of her carefully prepared talking points about toxic masculinity and irresponsible behavior seemed hollow now that she understood the kind of man Dean Martin really was when the cameras weren't rolling. After the show, Patricia did something she had never done before after one of her television appearances. She asked herself whether she had been wrong. She started making phone calls, first to contacts at various hospitals in New York and Los Angeles, then to people who worked with children's charities. Slowly, she began to piece together the real story of Dean Martin's private life. What she discovered shocked her. For more than 15 years, Dean Martin had been quietly visiting children's hospitals across the country. He never brought cameras, never issued press releases, never used these visits to improve his public image. He just showed up, sang songs, told jokes, and spent time with kids who were facing the worst moments of their lives. Hospital workers told Patricia stories that brought tears to her eyes. Dean singing lullabies to children who were too sick to sleep. Dean paying for experimental treatments that families couldn't afford. Dean flying across the country on his own dime to visit a child who had requested to meet him before a surgery. One nurse at Cedars-Sinai told Patricia, "Mr. Martin has been coming here for years. He never wants any attention for it. He just shows up, spends time with the kids, and leaves. Some of these children have never had a visitor other than him." Patricia Morris spent the next 3 weeks researching Dean Martin's private life, and everything she discovered contradicted the image she had attacked on television.
The man she had called emotionally unavailable had been married to his second wife for over 20 years and was a devoted father to 7 children. The man she had accused of treating women as objects had quietly paid for college educations for dozens of young women whose families couldn't afford it. The man she had claimed was irrelevant to modern society had been using his fame and fortune to help people for decades without ever seeking credit. Patricia realized she had made the same mistake that many critics of that era made. She had confused Dean Martin the performer with Dean Martin the person. The drinking, the playboy image, the casual attitude, it was all an act, a carefully crafted persona that helped him entertain audiences while protecting his real self from public scrutiny. The real Dean Martin was a private man who used his success to quietly help others, especially children who needed hope in their darkest hours. 3 weeks after their disastrous television encounter, Patricia Morris did something unprecedented in her career. She wrote a public apology. Her letter, published in major newspapers across the country, read in part, I recently made serious misjudgments about Dean Martin's character based solely on his public persona. I have since learned that the real Dean Martin is a man of extraordinary compassion who has spent decades helping others without seeking recognition. I attacked him for being emotionally unavailable while he was visiting dying children. I criticized him for being shallow while he was anonymously funding scholarships and medical treatments. I was wrong, and I apologize. The letter caused a sensation. Patricia Morris, known for never backing down from her positions, had publicly admitted that she had misjudged one of the men she had most harshly criticized. Dean Martin never responded publicly to her apology. When reporters asked him about Patricia's letter, he just smiled and said, "The lady seems nice enough. I hope she's doing well." But privately, according to his family, Dean was deeply affected by Patricia's research into his charitable work. He had worked hard to keep his private good deeds secret, and he was genuinely concerned that the publicity might interfere with his ability to help people quietly. Tommy Rodriguez, the little boy Dean had left the television show to visit, lived for 6 more months after that night. Dean visited him every week until the end, and according to Tommy's family, those visits were the highlights of his final months. The incident with Patricia Morris taught America an important lesson about the danger of judging people based on their public image. Dean Martin had created a persona that was designed to entertain, not to reveal his true character. The drinking, the playboy image, the casual attitude toward relationships, the seemingly shallow approach to life, it was all performance art.
The real Dean Martin was a man who understood that true coolness wasn't about being emotionally distant. It was about being strong enough to care deeply while making it look effortless. He spent decades helping others while never letting that generosity interfere with his ability to entertain. Patricia Morris learned that sometimes the people we think we understand the least are the ones who have the most to teach us about character, compassion, and what it really means to use your success to make the world a better place. The notorious woman who had mocked Dean Martin on live TV discovered that the cameras had indeed caught the truth, just not the truth she expected. The truth was that Dean Martin was exactly the kind of man that the world needed more of, not less.